All right, without further ado, Megan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon to everyone here in the room and for those streaming in as well. And I know there's a live virtual streaming too, so good afternoon to those audience as well. My name is Megan C, Director of Partnerships at EcoBusiness, and it's lovely to be here today with my very esteemed panelists. But before I go on to introduce them, I'd like to set the context for today's discussion. It will be on climate finance, the road to COP28. We know that the most recent IPCC report shared that we are way off track towards meeting our climate goals, where even if every country in the world delivers on its current climate pledges, there's still probably not enough to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. With just 7 years left to achieve a 43% reduction in global emissions, we know that the global community has to step forward and catalyze pragmatic and transformational action to maintain the level of emissions that's been established by the Paris Agreement. It is no surprise then that climate finance is emerging as a key focus ahead of the upcoming UN COP28, including the ways to mobilize private finance and reform financial strategies and models. So the questions here that we seek to find answers today: what is the influence of the COP28 agenda on this Asian region? What are some financial strategies and models that have been successfully adopted in this region and beyond? What are key barriers towards financing climate solutions across regions and economic sectors? With that, my speakers here today will shed some light on all these questions, and I'd like to introduce them as well. There's Maria Goravanchi, the Regional Manager for the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC for short. We have Nakul Zaferi, the Partner and Co-Head Climate Investment Strategy for Leapfrog. And last but not least, we have Pandu Sharia, Managing Partner of Indies Capital. With that, we've already been chat that there will be a Q&A session happening later on, so please do keep your questions in mind as we go forward with this discussion. But with that, I would love to go for the opening question from all my speakers today. What is one word or phrase that you use to describe the state of climate finance in Asia? I'd like to go to Maria first.
Thank you, Megan. I would say the phrase that I would use from the DFC perspective is that Asia is a particular region of the world that is vulnerable to climate change, and those geographies and demographics are highly impacted by climate change, in particular climate hazards like drought, flooding, rising sea level changes.
Thank you, Maria, and on to you, Nakul.
Thank you. My one word, I don't know if there are two words, is intergenerational. And this is, very exciting for us as investors, because there is a very clear realization across the stakeholders of climate finance that there is an intergenerational humanitarian and commercial opportunity. And again, when I say intergenerational, this is once in many lifetimes that value migration is taking place towards sustainable business models while creating significant positive outcomes, and especially in emerging markets. And that's how we're excited about that stakeholders across the Asian region are now aware about this, are taking steps to accelerate adoption across mitigation and adaptation strategies across climate finance.
And on to you, Pandu.
Yeah, for me, I would say hopeful and hopefully ambitious. And the reason being, I think last year, and I'll speak on behalf in terms of Indonesia, I also vice chairing the ASEAN Business Advisory Council for this year. Last year we hosted the G20, and the top of mind for us is what is happening today with respect to climate change. And this is perhaps top of mind for our government and also the people in Indonesia. For ASEAN Summit this year, we're hosting in September, and hopefully the US President will be coming, as well as President Xi from China and 9 other head of states, including from Malaysia. One of the things that we want to focus is collaborating together among ASEAN nations and ASEAN Plus to focus on climate change. And a lot of it centers around energy transition and the opportunities around it. And I don't like to beat around the bush. I'm not very good talking in this type of forum, but the most important is, pragmatically speaking, what are the actionable items? And for this, you also need government intervention in a very meaningful way. So, been very excited that the last couple of months there's been real action happening with respect to the business of EV. A lot of things happening today with respect to carbon credit market development in Indonesia. And third, it's with respect to food security and sustainability that is also now top of mind for our country. So hopefully this can be an example for cross-collaboration among ASEAN nations.
Thank you so much, Pandu. I'm going to go to Maria next. Pandu said, about something about actionable items and also having governments and stakeholders come together really in the lead up to COP28. So the DFC announced last year that it committed more than about 2.3 billion in climate-linked development projects during fiscal year 2022. And as part of its prioritization of climate-linked investment, DFC is also supporting new energy solutions that provide reliable, affordable energy to help developing countries meet the rising demand and support economic development. Tell us more about DFC's role in this climate finance space and really what steps are being taken to align its investments with the goals of COP28.
Certainly, Megan. So, for those of you who maybe are less familiar with us, DFC is the U.S. government's development finance institution. Our role is to support private sector investment in addressing critical challenges in emerging markets. We focus our investments principally in lower income markets and lower middle income markets. And we also support a variety of sectors. We invest in 5 key development sectors. One is clean energy and critical infrastructure. The second is healthcare. The third is technology. The fourth is agribusiness. And the fifth is financial inclusion. But across all those sectors, we apply both a gender and a climate lens framework. And in doing so, not only are we evaluating the investments from a commercial viability perspective for sustainability, but also applying best standards, international best practices with respect to environmental and social impacts, and protection of the environment, human rights, and worker rights. You're correct in that DFC did finance and commit $2.3 billion in fiscal year 2022 for climate-linked transactions. We've done that by taking a bold step in addressing a very pragmatic climate finance agenda. That climate finance agenda, at its core, addresses 3 key pillars. The first is mobilizing capital and recognizing the mobilization of capital throughout the ecosystem. We are just one of those many players and need to work with other partners throughout the capital structure to make these climate transactions viable. DFC does that through our financing products, which can include things like loans, financial guarantees, private equity investments, and political risk insurance. We also can now provide technical assistance funding to those investments that are coming to DFC for one of those types of financing. The second pillar, as part of their climate agenda, is we are also seeking to scale and diversify the origination of the types of climate finance transactions we're looking at. So to Pandu's point earlier, yes, certainly we're supporting renewable energy investments, but also looking to e-mobility, to infrastructure, to agribusiness, to water and sanitation, recognizing that climate doesn't operate in a vacuum, but rather cuts across these sectors. And then thirdly, trying to move the needle by bringing in development finance capital from DFC to address specifically the sub-segment, if I may call it, of adaptation finance. And this segment, I would say, disproportionately impacts many of the countries in Asia because of the fact that many of the countries in Asia are facing climate hazards, but also because sub-sectors of those groups within those communities are very vulnerable populations, specifically women and children and marginalized communities who on average are disproportionately affected. And then lastly, I will just conclude by saying that to further embolden us to meet some of these metrics within DFC as an institution itself, we have put in place a target to reach net zero in our investment portfolio by 2040.
Thank you so much, Maria. I think you brought up really, really important points, which we will address later on regards to mobilizing capital in terms of addressing as well the most marginalized communities in Southeast Asia. But Nakul, I wanted to go to you first. Tell us more, about leapfrog investments, and in particular, how the investments as well are being aligned with the goals of COP28.
Thank you, Megan. Leapfrog has been around for 15 years, investing in businesses that enabled emerging low-income consumer to move into prosperity. We are focused on investing in products and services that are essentially allowing access to essential services across financial inclusion, healthcare, and now eventually making emerging consumers accelerate their transition to a low-carbon future while making them climate resilient. We are a growth stage investor. We want to partner with businesses that have achieved a product market fit, that are moving towards their next scale, and where it is very clear that there is an outsized, disproportionate positive impact that is being created. For us, climate is a very natural extension of our strategy. I also want to, what you alluded to, the fact that climate cuts across sectors. One thing that is very important to understand is climate, unlike many other things, is not a category like you have in tech or a classification or an industry. Climate is a physical reality, and it is motivating a societal transition at a scale that has never happened before. It is impacting how we move around. It is impacting how we generate energy. It is impacting how we get food, and it is impacting how we build cities. And at Leapfrog, what we do at Climate is essentially investing in energy, food, mobility, and built environment. And because that's what is going to impact 3.5 billion emerging consumers who haven't really played a part in emitting mass amount of emissions over a period of time, but are going to go through this massive growth phase that we are experiencing, specifically large countries in Asia in the next decade. And the choice is whether you do it on the back of fossil fuels, or do we enable a green leap which allows them to grow behind a green transition.
Thank you so much, Nakul, for that. And for Pandu, just a final kind of general overview question for you. Indies Capital has an AUM of approximately US $800 million as of June 2022. How is the company, you seem to not know that, supporting portfolio companies to align with the goals of COP28?
Yeah, I think for us, the main business that we do is to help companies, and I guess essentially growth companies in Southeast Asia, in particular Indonesia, and we help them to be able to grow and go public, right? I think that's one of the goals that we do. I think pretty similar. I don't want to echo what both of you have said, but I think when you talk about the change in terms of making companies to become net zero by X certain numbers, right? The Indonesia is thinking by 2060 already net zero. So when you talk COP28, which is only, 4 months away, 3-4 months, a lot of it is more about how can you make the companies that we invest are doing the proper actions, things that they're doing in terms of their CapEx spend, in terms of their capital expenditure, where it goes. For example, let's talk about coal, dirty coal companies. How are they thinking about CapEx spend the next 5-7 years? What I find so encouraging today, and some of the companies that we have exposure to that are coal related, probably 90% now are moving to non-coal. So what's so interesting, talk about the top 3 or 4 energy companies that are coal related, they're already suggesting 2035, 2040, so about 10 years ahead of the government to become net zero carbon. And that's pretty interesting because that's the ultimate goal, right? And Indonesia today, 60% of the energy is fossil fuel, similar to America, actually very similar. But the good thing is that all the new build will come from renewable energy. So when you look at the picture, and there's already public information, by 2045, actually majority will come from renewable. And that's not long. That's only 22 years away in our lifetime. This is 20 years is not long. For Indonesia, maybe it's about 2-3 presidents away from this to achieve. So, I'm actually, that's why I said I started the word hopeful, and I think ambitious, because Indonesia is also not a small country. Just some facts, today we're at 5,000 GDP per capita, 290 million. By 2045, we'll probably be around 330 million with a GDP per capita, maybe 10,000, 11,000, which makes us a G7. So imagine, a country that is now number 16 in the world going to G7, changing its entire energy mix within our lifetime. So again, ambitious, hopeful.
Thank you so much for that. I'd like to go back to you, Maria. We did speak about earlier about the adaptation finance and importance as well of focusing as well on Asia Pacific's marginalized communities. In terms of that, we know that the region as well is highly vulnerable to climate change, increasingly facing very severe consequences because of it as well. With climate change being still such a huge challenge, in this Asia Pacific region, as we as well seek to balance climate protection together with economic development, how can we ensure that the economic benefits of climate action are widely shared, particularly those who have been historically marginalized or excluded from development opportunities? I'd like also to pose this to Nakul and Pandu as well later on.
Certainly. So I think it's incumbent on us, while we are all facing these climate challenges, the same barrier provides an opportunity for us to develop new innovative financing structures to address these needs. I can share with you perhaps 2 specific examples of investments that DFC has made in Asia that has supported a blended finance approach to addressing these adaptation types of challenges in the marketplace. Of course, this is done through ecosystem players. So the first is a DFC loan that we made to Inshu Resilience Fund, which is a fund being managed by Blue Orchard. And through that fund, they are partnering with financial institutions in various Asian countries to support smallholder farmers, particularly farmers who own livestock, for example. So in the instance of one underlying farmer, if he or she, and oftentimes again, they're disproportionately women, if their livestock happen to die or get ill, they suffer an immediate impact in terms of their inability to generate revenue. So creating a bespoke insurance product through this financing structure that protects the livelihoods of that smallholder farmer and allows them to continue to ensure their livelihood is retained and remains in spite of these climate challenges. Another example, having said that climate cuts across different sectors, is in the water and sanitation space, where DFC extended an equity investment into a water fund that's being managed by Incofin, again supporting communities in Africa and also in Asia, multi-country and jurisdictional. And the intent being here that through DFC's equity investment and our partnership with Incofund and other stakeholders, we're providing more innovative capital or blended capital to address water and sanitation needs. Again, recognizing that typically vulnerable communities, within those vulnerable communities, there are even marginalized segments. And oftentimes when there are droughts and limitations on water, that indirectly fall to women and children. And so providing alternative solutions like water mobile kiosks to be able to access clean water, smaller scale water treatment facilities to be able to clean water in multiple locations and directly at site, as opposed to providing time and distance for those treatments.
Thank you so much, Maria. And Nakul, over to you.
Our strong belief is profit with purpose. Purpose and impact is embedded in our investment thesis, and our focus is on emerging low-income consumers. As I mentioned earlier, entire industries are getting converted into climate investing space. for example, energy or mobility. And therefore, what is important is on back of growth prospects, these vulnerable communities will either have access to subpar products or services, if not delivered through cutting edge, evolved, climate-backed, innovative product and services. And that's what we want to fund. And we believe this can happen at scale because of the growth prospects, what we call global growth markets or emerging markets are going through. There are a combination of financial instruments we'll have to work with, which is blended finance, which is public-private partnerships, which is equity, which is debt. And we believe a combination of availability of low-cost technology, enabling regulations. Sometimes regulations are moving faster than business models, both from a penal structure and an incentivization structure, unlocks a lot of capital. And this capital is moving towards product and services which will get access to these vulnerable communities or emerging low-income consumers. And we believe that there is massive amount of superior risk-adjusted return possibility while addressing vulnerabilities around impacts of climate change. And we are seeing this specifically in the food industry. Food safety and security is a very, very critical aspect that we are looking at. We are excited because on one hand, there are massive risks climate change can make on how crops are grown. Weather patterns can create havoc around a number of things. Our financial services segment looks at insurance companies, which look at these food products. We have technology investments around weather-based tech companies, which address some of these opportunities as well. We believe that with deep specialization around understanding of some of these climate risks and opportunities, and also understanding of where the emerging low-income consumer is going for consumption, allows us to address both profit and purpose together.
Thank you so much, Nakul. And on to Pandu, I think he's been putting on his thinking cap quite a bit. But just to add on to that as well, would love to hear from you. How then, with all the issues and with a great example as well that Maria stated as to what DFC is doing, how can we mobilize greater private investment, private sector investment into sustainable development, especially in these marginalized communities?
Marginalized communities. To be honest, 2 years ago, very good to do this, because cost of capital was so low. So everybody, give you a good example. Everybody invests in warung business. Warung, the small shop kiosk business, because the TAM seems very high, and then we want to give financing. And everybody's using the same word, marginalized, finance, open finance, etc. So in the world of low cost of capital, that happened a lot. There's almost $1 billion plus in Indonesia, simply trying to address quote-unquote warung business, small stall business, providing working capital, trying to figure out their financing, etc. Then, when the cost capital goes up, they realize NPL becomes a big problem. No kidding lah. And that's actually why I think a lot of the effort is how do you go from the unbanked, that's sort of the unbanked, to become underbanked. And the underbanked become bankable, and that's the story of a country developing. Now, the question today is actually in the tech world, it's a very tough time to be in, right? Cost of capital is high. The capital that we do, both of us probably, is very high, right? So yes, we want to help those that is marginalized, but again, as you say, profit with a purpose. For me, profit with a purpose that has an end game that is clear, right? So to be honest with you, when you talk about marginalized community today, and please don't hate me, I know this is an impact conference, and for me, every investment is an impact, regardless. The question is, you want to do good with it or not, right? But today in the marginalized society or marginalized group in Indonesia, we have about 25 to 30 million people that I consider as marginalized. You have to work between private sector and the government extremely closely, because that's actually the role of the state. The role of us is how do you create the underbanked become bankable. To be honest, the unbankable, there is a reason it's unbankable. I'm being honest here, don't hate me too much for saying this. So During the time of low cost of capital, 2019 to 2022, everybody's going to do the unbankable. You know what happened? The funders become unbankable, and the companies become unbankable. This is truism. If you look at all the warung business that has invested, and I'm guilty of also investing, about $1.5 billion today, the market cap of the largest one, minus the cash, the business is negative value. But it will grow over time, per today, right? So in my view, you have to be very patient when you're talking about the unbankable. If you're talking the underbanked, a little bit different. Then you go from underbanked to bankable. So, you know, this is the way my view, again, my view can change if the facts change. For today, I think if you want to talk about the marginalized or the really marginalized, you have to work together with government or pseudo-government businesses.
Thank you so much, Pandu. And that leads me to my next point on partnerships. And Maria, you did mention this a couple of times as well. You know, just earlier in March, it was announced that the Indonesian Investment Authority and USDOC, they signed an MOU to catalyze investments in Indonesia, specifically with respect to sustainable development projects. How can more partnerships like these, you know, really be developed and also leveraged to accelerate climate finance and climate action in these regions?
I think ultimately it's driven by the shared goal, right, to address climate finance more broadly. But as great as intention is, I think DFC feels strongly that we also need to deliver actionable investments through transactions, right, which is where we can add the most value in the ecosystem based on our specific mandate. And in order to do that, speaking to like-minded institutions, whether they be DFIs, governments, commercial players, export credit agencies, other multilaterals, bilaterals, DFIs, to figure out if there is who are the players working in these targeted countries, and then how is it that we can join forces, bringing the different tools and investment capital that we can provide to de-risk certain segments in the capital structure and in the waterfall to ultimately address what's needed. But that groundwork, I think, is also happening, you know, in small working group sessions to try to ensure that these MOUs also transition and transfer into actual investments.
Thank you so much, Maria. And I wanted to go back to you, Pandu. I know, again, you mentioned, you know, the part on partnerships, and I know that earlier this year as well, AC Ventures, Indies Capital, and Penjana Capital as well just signed a memorandum of cooperation to facilitate cross-border investment, technology transfer, in key sectors such as education, waste management, and also to help find impactful opportunities from both Indonesia and Malaysia. Tell us more about that. And we'd also love to hear the challenges in negotiating this MOU.
Well, our business is to serve. I think, you know, when you talk about why we have to make profit, because at the end it serves our customer, which essentially 93% of our customers are either sovereign wealth funds, some are teacher retirements, and they want their money to work for them. So at the end of the day, I'm just, again, being very pragmatic. What are the key business opportunities that I think will make money and generate return for our customers, or some people call it limited partners, right? And for us right now, energy transition is a big deal. I think anything related to the mobility space is super exciting, and EV. Anything related to carbon credit is super exciting. Indonesia is probably 30-35%, depending on who you talk to, of the potential carbon producers in the world, right? So now there's already talk between Indonesia, Brazil, Congo to make essentially 70% of this market, right? And it's exciting because that can potentially be a part of the solution of this energy transition problem. So that's number two. Number three, renewable energy is going to be a significant part. As I mentioned, the next 2 decades is going to be significant investment happening. Again, because it's a combination between what the government wants to do, the society wants to do, and the private sector. So when you talk about, you know, these 3 themes, and then lastly, anything related to waste management and clean air, that's also something, clean air, a bit personal, yeah, because my wife just spoke just now in another event, and she just mentioned air quality, because Jakarta, #1, the worst air quality, even worse than New York 2 weeks ago. So Jakarta, even though now 12 most expensive cities to live in, but #1 in air quality problem. which will affect as a country develop from developing market to develop. Why? Because high quality talent only want two things: quality of life and tax. And the quality of life outside of education and healthcare is also air quality. And there's others, but those are the big team, right? So we're trying to tackle these problems through investment in a very meaningful way. So if I look at just our things that we've invested, I would say probably 40% of our portfolio or of our investment will probably go there outside of the core e-commerce, logistic, and fintech. I think a lot of this investment will go to that, right? So, you know, that's why I'm saying I'm being hopeful, because a lot of this will be venture risk, in my view. Even EV will be venture risk. Why? Because we don't know how the conversion will play out. So that's why I'm both excited, a bit scared, but gotta do it. You know, that's the way. And if it's not us doing it, who else will do it?
Thank you so much, Nako. And on to you, not Nako, Pandu. Nako, on to you. I would love to also hear your thoughts on this as well. But also in particular, you know, there is a huge climate investment gap, currently about 11 trillion. How do you think we can best close this climate investment gap? And what more needs to be done to accelerate investment into these areas that we most need investment in?
Yeah. I did my first environmental finance deal in the late 90s. And I did it because no one else was willing to do it. I was a junior most team member in the team, and I had no idea what that was happening. But for a long time, it was difficult to explain what climate change investing was. And over the last 20 years, this has changed. And now everyone knows what is climate investing. So there has been a lot over the time, from a regulatory perspective, from an NGO perspective, from you know, physical realities manifesting themselves, coming across. But what is even more interesting is the youngest cohort in the world is called Gen Alpha now. These are people born between 2012 and 2024. And they are the largest cohort in the world. They are you know, digitally native. They are the most influential in purchasing decisions, but they are also born in a time when there is only one reality around climate change. And therefore, large corporations like the FMCGs of the world are excited to sell to them in the next decade. And that's where these cohorts are going to demand sustainable products. And therefore, climate change essentially is a business problem created by businesses, and businesses will play a very disproportionate part in solving that. And we are seeing one part of acceleration happening. And that's one side of the story. The second side is, I think governments are realizing what kind of a disproportionate role they play in solving climate change. And therefore, we have never seen this, but regulations are moving faster than they have ever moved. I mean, you know, I've lived through the carbon story 1.0 between 2008 and 2012. And it's fascinating to see how fast it has come back. And it has come back in a very meaningful way in times where business models that don't exist in traditional financial metrics are possible at scale because of carbon financing. And carbon financing will be a very key instrument in spearheading some of these business models. Obviously, we are a long way to go because a number of things need to work out. And that is the second part. The third part is innovation. I think we're seeing massive amount of innovation happening across business models, technology, cross-border collaboration. I mean, imagine, you know, sitting in this room, we are from different geographies, different organizations, but we are talking about one goal. It has taken us a long time to get here. So I'm going to borrow Pandu's word about being hopeful. You know, we are very hopeful. Someone was telling me that, you know, you are peddling optimism. But, well, we need optimism. We need to be hopeful to getting things done. And let me tell you, again, borrowing from you, Pandu, mobility. I have never seen a transition to electrification at such a pace ever before. Two-wheelers and three-wheelers, the total cost of ownership has now gone down below ICE engines. Not only that, but in some markets, second-hand pricing is falling down, which means that electrification is getting more real. We are seeing new business models as mobility as a service, delivery as a service, battery as a service coming up, which never existed in the West, but they are happening at scale. So again, we are seeing businesses playing critical role, and also the social norms are changing. Every large company, every school talks about reduce, reuse, recycle, which is a wide spectrum of the cohesive nature of solving the problem. The last point I'll make, which I was going to make to the ending, but I'll make it now, is it's taken us 28 years, right? COP28 to get here. And if you look at what an individual does at the age of 28, you're supposed to be independent financially. But you're also supposed to be reflecting on where you want to go, where you have come from. And I believe that COP28, there is this massive tailwind around agreeing to how we're going to transition at scale and address the climate problem.
Thank you so much for all the very, very valuable insights there. At this point, I know that we have a question and answer going on in just a little bit, so I'd like to prepare the audience for that, to pick up the microphone, if you have questions. But before we go on to that, Maria, I wanted to ask as well, we did talk about how climate change, in terms of tackling the crisis right now, it is a huge society transition on a cross-sectoral basis as well, where innovation, technology, partnerships all come to play in terms of reaching COP28 and having that be a successful discussion, really. What are the biggest barriers then to financing climate solutions across different sectors and regions? And how do you think best we can address these challenges to achieve the necessary scale of investment that we need?
So I think maybe there are a couple of key barriers that we're observing. But again, I would flip it around and say these barriers are also opportunities to solve. I mean, again, echoing the hopeful messaging from my fellow panelists, to solve these barriers through more innovative financing structures that have either are nascent and are being developed as we speak, or have yet to be developed. So, one of the key challenges that we face is greenhouse gas emissions. And I think many of the countries around the world are focusing on that by pivoting and transitioning to clean energy. That continues to be a core goal for most of the world. And most of those investments have a very clear contractual bankable approach to doing that, whether it's distributed renewable energy, whether it's independent power production. I think as you get further down the climate finance spectrum, right, when you start talking about nature-based solutions and perhaps adaptation and mitigation opportunities, which could cut across different sectors, that's where we need to find new models that hopefully can be replicable to help address this issue of scalability, because adaptation and, for example, agribusiness, methane emissions also contribute significantly to the climate change goals for many of our NDCs across jurisdictions. But being able to find new models that can be easily replicable and financed at scale, I think is something that we're all struggling to find in some of these more innovative areas.
Yeah, Nako, I would love to get your thoughts on that as well, especially coming from the private investment side of things. What in your point of view, is the biggest barrier to finding investment into these areas?
I think they're there. Barriers will exist always. There are some key aspects that we want solved. For example, frameworks and standards and regulations. 1,700 frameworks, 360 standards, 600 regulations across the world around how to report climate, how to measure sustainability. I mean, we need standardization to accelerate. We need regulatory bodies to talk to each other. We want governments, we want investors, we want a standard language coming through, because that will allow us to compare, measure, verify, report, and be true to the goals we are looking at. So, data is a problem. Hopefully, there are large mobilizations happening. The second is there is friction towards what is additional in this nature. And additionality comes in many ways. There are in carbon markets, there are in why the West should transition towards developing markets, who is right, who is wrong. We need to remove friction. And we need to be all in. I again want to remind the fact that we don't have time. We are breaching 1.5. And what we don't realize is what will happen if we breach 1.5. And it's going to happen in our lifetimes. I'm assuming we'll be too old to get impacted by it, but definitely the future generation is going to get impacted. But we are seeing some physical manifestation of this risk. For example, when India goes through a heat wave, there is migration taking place. And then this moves to a scale of migration that the world has not seen before. And we'll see this in a lot of emerging markets. But we are also seeing heat waves in developed markets. Heat waves in developed markets have a very clear impact on how agriculture evolves. And we don't have the technology to address this. And similarly, if you have impacts of floods and droughts, the food capitals of the world, most of them are now in emerging markets, will not be able to deliver food for the West. So the point I'm trying to drive it as that investing in emerging markets means also investing in developed markets. So that is a big barrier that we need to try and focus on accelerating, not only to decarbonize the West, but also invest in emerging markets at scale.
Thank you so much, Naku, for that. At this point of time, would like to open the floor to questions. Does anyone out there have questions for any of the speakers here? If you're a little bit too, oh, there's one back there. There's one gentleman, is there a mic that's going to be passed to him? Or are you going to type it in the chat? There, oh. There's also the app where you can access the chat to put in the questions as well to the audience too.
Hello. Hi, afternoon all. So my name is Arvind Jacob and I hail from India and currently associated as a Chief Operating Officer with Namdev Invest. We are into MSME lending and moving towards EV, solar panels funding and do LCVs. But what I see currently is that nowadays people they love to travel a lot and more efficiently. But are they in the course of saving fuel in this entire process? So that is my one worry as I move desperately into this segment. Second thing is, one of the biggest concerns in the field of renewable energy is power generated depending upon natural resources that are uncontrollable by humans. So for example, if a solar powered electricity is generated when only sunshine is available and it turns off at night, and which is where we depend fully on the wind for the availability of the wind. If that doesn't happen, the turbine or that solar energy or that windmill will not have any impact. In that case, we all get stranded. Because if you look at it in Rajasthan, there is a sector, there is a town which is known as Jaisalmer, and you have maximum windmills out there. And we face a lot of challenges at time. People would like to deviate in that sector, moving as a first-time consumer or a borrower to us. But then we really have to look at this aspect as to how to churn this worry of this with respect to a windmill or maybe a turbine or maybe making things more effective towards green energy. So this was one cause of worry, and just wanted an insightedness on this.
Maria, go ahead and take that.
Thank you for the question. I think perhaps one potential mitigant is augmenting your renewable energy generation with ancillary systems like battery energy storage solutions that can continue to collect and store power, but can be utilized to better stabilize the power generation from either wind or PV solar assets.
Sorry, may I, if anyone
Apologies. Apologies. So, but the problem that you rightly said, it is the windmill or the turbine that operates. But if you really look at it, many times the farmers are devastated because the turbine or that support of the windmill is not occurring, either due to excessive heat or due to low, winds blowing. So you need to understand, because when we function in a remote area or in a remote market, like the deserts, so this is very prominent. So we have got Suzlon, which is a big manufacturer and a player of windmills in these markets. And we would like to give them if you're pitching something as a financer, so we would like to give them a one-time remedy. What is the alternate for it? So that is what I'm asking you all, the panelists out here.
So
If I may, if I may, can we take this offline? I maybe you can approach the speakers later on. Thank you so much. I actually have one question regards to COP28. So we all know that a recent Bonn Climate Change Conference has just taken place, and with that, a huge sticking point was climate finance, where we know that developing states and civil society representatives really called on regional nations to honor their financial pledges of $100 billion per year. This was pledged back in 2009, and right now I think the target is not met right now. So we don't really know what's going to happen from now till COP28. But then I guess the question, which might be a little bit tricky as well, is that we've talked a lot about partnerships and how coming together as a multilateral party or bloc can come together with really good results and outcome. But with the Bonn Climate Change Conference just happened, and with the COP28 coming up as well, what would your opinion be as to the effectiveness of such multilateral consensus-based meetings such as COP28 as opposed to local individual action that's taken at the country or even just the regional level as well to advance climate finance? Pandu,
I think at the end of the day, what you're seeing now, some countries decide to be very ambitious. Some country does wait and see. I can only comment Indonesia, right? I cannot comment on others, but essentially what Indonesia is trying to do is to be very ambitious on its climate target in terms of, for example, carbon market. Our stock exchange already will have a carbon market. We're going to launch it. We're going to also work together with both, in this case, who's been very aggressive is the Middle East and now the US. This is also kind of funny. Even this climate change, which should just be everyone doing it together, geopolitics is top of mind. Even when I talk about carbon market, there's two carbon market. The one that China is trying to do in terms of pushing, there's an agenda to this, and the US, right? So for example, if you want to have a carbon credit, do you want to have it by Vera or gold standard? China also has one. I'm not saying every human is good, right? I would say nobody's perfect, but it's so funny, funny but also a bit scary that geopolitics is top of mind for me in investing and also in terms of allocating capital, because when you're doing it, who's the large buyers at the end? To be honest, it's just two countries, America and China. And this is something where, for Indonesia, when you talk about our agenda and you're talking about many countries and one, I think Indonesia just say, okay, we just try to do it. We already announced 2050 and 60, and those who wants to go with us, let's go. Because it's very difficult to coordinate, but I think 178 countries. So we're just focusing on us and also our coordination with our fellow countrymen across ASEAN. The rest out of that, it's a very difficult task. Let's just put it that way.
Thank you, Pandu, for that thought. Maria, would like to comment on that as well.
Sure. I think one thing that each country can do to accelerate climate change and address the COP28 goals is continue to embed climate change requirements and targets through the regulatory environment. So specifically through banking supervisory roles, through securities regulators. I think oftentimes, or through legislation, in each market, I think in many ways the market, the private sector and the market reacts to that. I mean, I look at my own home country of the US through the passage of legislation of the Inflation Production Act. It's been immense in terms of creating dynamics in the private sector to further propel renewable energy generation and development of that in the US. And I see it also in Southeast Asia in terms of, many of the banking regulators and now securities regulators are really pushing the envelope in terms of leaning toward what those specific markets should be doing in terms of promoting green bonds or climate bonds to incentivize and motivate other market players to act more quickly.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that thought as well. And Nakul, I wonder if you have anything to add to Pandu and Maria on that point.
No, my only point is that unless there is a green discount, scale won't happen. And for green discount to take place, there is technology, there is regulation, there is adoption. And what I mean by green discount is that adoption of sustainable technologies to address climate change has to be similar or cheaper than existing solutions. And we believe that the green discount is now available in many segments which are addressing essential services. Again, as I said, around energy, mobility, food, or built environment. And this is going to allow governments to accelerate this with different instruments, whether it is blended finance, whether it is carbon finance, whether it is risk disclosures like TCFTs, or whether it is exchanges trying to allow issuing green bonds and orange bonds and blue bonds at scale.
Thank you so much, Nakul. And on that note, all three of you have just really, really good points in the lead up to COP28, with Maria coming from DFC's point of view, Pandu from Indonesia's point of view as well, as Nakul from the private investment point of view as well. With that, I have one last question for all of you. And with just only over 5 months to COP28, what in your opinion is one very crucial point or issue that needs to be addressed by the global community to successfully mobilize climate finance to meet climate goals? I'm going to go for Maria and then end off with Pandu.
So I think from my perspective, I would say, I think in COP28, there's going to be a reevaluation, like a global stock take of how well all of us have been doing against Paris Agreement objectives. And I think one element that still needs a lot of work that goes back to some of the discussion we had today is focus on adaptation finance. And I mean, the UN has reported that on average globally, we need anywhere from $300 to $800 billion annually up to 2050 to be able to address the need and the gap in that specific segment of climate finance. Which goes back to finding innovative structures to address it and bringing capital providers from across the ecosystem to address it.
Thank you, Maria, for that. And on to Nakul.
I'm going to double down on adaptation. I think it's 100% of acceleration around adaptation. And adaptation is large, but it's also the least active field across climate investors or climate stakeholders. And I believe adaptation itself requires mass amount of collective collaboration. And I believe that involving businesses more on adaptation while doing mitigation is something that I'm looking forward to.
That's a really good point. Thank you so much. And Pandu, on to you as well.
I just want to end just the way I started. I think to be ambitious and to be hopeful. We can only encourage our fellow countrymen what they think we should do. But I think, again, maybe just think of each other in the best possible way. Because I don't think anybody want to live in this world that will be worse for our children. Right? Just that. I think that's important. So obviously when you talk COP28, and obviously I know the Paris Agreement will be a reference, just think, I would like to encourage all these leaders to always think best about each other. And that hopefully will create progress, because I know each one of us want to live in a world that's better for each one of our children. That's why I say ambitious and hopeful, and we work best what we can do best what we can control. So for Indonesia, again, I go back to Indonesia. If we're being ambitious, then let's just do on Indonesian side. And the only thing we can do is simply encourage, right? I think that's probably the most pragmatic way to end this conversation, because it's such a big topic and it's about the entire world. So we just work what's best for us, because at the end we want to do what's best for our children.
Thank you so much, Pandu. And on that very, very hopeful and hopefully ambitious note as well, I'd like to thank everyone for being here today, and to thank our very esteemed speakers, Pandu, Nakul, and Maria, for being here to shine some light on this topic on the road to COP28. With that, I'm going to pass on the time to the MC to bring us to the next segment.
Next on the agenda at 4:30 is the keynote on driving impact at scale through philanthropy and social finance. So that will happen at 4:30. So we look forward to having you back in the plenary hall. Thank you.